All right, well, everyone, welcome to the Engaged Bhakti podcast. I'm your host, Krishna Kishordas, aka Dr. Christopher Fici, and this is our first batch of podcasts that we're doing for the Engaged Bhakti podcast. We're launching 4 of them here at once, and this podcast, I'm very happy to be with one of my dearest friends and colleagues, Mr. Gopal D. Patel, aka Gopal-Lila Dasa. Gopal, say hello to the audience.
Hello, audience. It's great to be with all of you.
Gopal has a very nice microphone, which is step up. I'm still trying to I'm just speaking naturally. I don't have much of a bookcase game yet, but that's how we're doing it. So this podcast, this conversation, we're launching this first series. We've had these great conversations with really wonderful senior devotees, Yogesh Vardas, Rancher Prime, Garuda Das, devotees who have been really serious scholars in this movement, serious intellectuals and serious devotees, really wonderful people. And we've explored different contours of what Engaged Bhakti might be, because I think on the outset here, we're trying to be very clear that I kind of have a little elevator pitch. Maybe I'll say it here at the beginning, what it is. Engaged Bhakti explores the practice of Bhakti Yoga in relationship with the various movements for social and ecological justice in the world today. We draw upon the deep roots of the teachings of Bhakti Yoga from the Gaudiya or Caitanya Vaishnava tradition, while also acknowledging and including the devotional expression of all spiritual traditions. So I think hopefully in future episodes, we'll have friends of ours from different traditions as well talking about devotion. We offer compelling conversations on how the concept, art, and practice of Bhakti can confront and heal the wounds created by systems of injustice and evil. So that's like our working elevator pitch, and it's an argument for social engagement. But I think up front, we're trying to be very clear that what Engaged Bhakti is a concept we're going to work through in these conversations. And what we'll do today, I think, Paul, you and I will kind of give a little primer to what we think this concept and practice is and where it might be going over the course of these next couple of conversations. Gopal, you and I work together in the Sacred Ecology Forum in the Bhakti Center. Do you want to give a little history about how that started? Because it's a really interesting story, actually.
Yeah, sure. So for folks who may not know, though, obviously the Bhakti Center is a project here in New York City, in Manhattan, just a block away from 26 Second Avenue. And it started from a conversation that I had with Radhanath Swami at the Govardhan Eco Village a number of years ago, maybe about 3 or 4 years ago now, where we were talking about various services I was involved with. And he suggested that we start a little group at the Bhakti Center that explores the intersection of ecology and bhakti. Mm-hmm. And so he asked a few of us to come together and think through kind of what does it mean to be a Vaishnava in the world today, you know, specifically within the context of New York City, to care about the environment and to try and make a positive change in that regard. And so it kind of came about, and there's a few of us part of the core team, and there's a broader community that's emerging here in New York City that are really excited and interested in those intersections of ecology and bhakti. So that's, in a nutshell, what the Sacred Ecology Forum is.
And it's such a natural connection. So we are our first podcast. We're also here with Rancher Prime, where we talked a lot about that and the sacredness of Earth. And Gopal, I think especially why Radhanath Swami asked you to help form this is that you are one of the leading Hindu environmentalists in the world, in my humble opinion. And you're the head of the Bhumi Project, and you also work with the United Nations. Could you talk a little bit about what the Bhumi Project is?
Yeah, sure. So the Bhumi Project is it's a project that's about 10 years old now, and it works at the intersection of Hinduism and climate change and sustainability. So what we do is we work with Hindu groups and leaders and communities globally to address environmental concerns. And we've done a range of campaigns and initiatives over many years now, mobilized tens of thousands of people for good environmental action. And through that work, we've been working closely, I wouldn't say closely, but we've been working with the United Nations for a few years. And a couple of years ago, I was appointed to the United Nations Multi-Faith Advisory Council, and I currently serve as one of the co-chairs of that council. So it's a 40-member body appointed by the UN of all the major religious organizations of the world working on sustainable development. And so my job there is to advise the UN and to chair the group to see how religion and spirituality can help the UN achieve its stated goals, which at the moment are the Sustainable Development Goals.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's work, the Bhumi project and the UN work, that's my main work. And that's something I've been doing now for about 10 years. And I've lived in India, we've done work in Africa, in all across the United States as well. So it has a global scope and mandate. And I'm very happy and excited to be living in New York City at this time in my life as well.
New York City, now suddenly the safest place in the world. And of course, we've done Hinduism, Great Hinduism, and we're part of this Great Hinduism and Ecology Conference at the Govardhan Eco Village. It was 2018, late 2018. That was in conjunction with the Yale Forum for Religion and Ecology. We also put together with the Yale Forum this Hinduism and Climate Change Conference. So there's really a wonderful community that we're part of scholars of Hinduism and a lot of Vaishnava scholars who are part of that as well, really looking at the depth of the ocean of Hinduism, the ocean of our tradition, how we live in it in an earth-honoring way, as I like to say, as we like to say.
Yep.
So, I mean, I would, in a future conversation, love to just talk about ecology, but I will start today just with kind of, people might be coming into this podcast being like, what the heck is Engaged Bhakti? What are these devotees on about? And we want to kind of give a little sense of what that might mean. And I always recall this, I remember we actually were coming back from that Yale conference, Hinduism and Climate Change, and me, you, and your better half were talking about this kind of idea of how we take this practice of bhakti that we feel so profoundly about, that we've centered our spiritual lives about, we believe is the highest truth, and how do we take it to apply it to these deep social issues that are in the world. Of course, a lot of our work is around climate change and ecological issues. And we've seen in the past few weeks, one of the reasons we really decided to get this podcast going, especially around the Black Lives Matter movement, and I was seeing a lot of devotees on social media really expressing a lot of heartfelt realizations. And so it's a question that's on a lot of people's minds, that how do we as devotees take the wisdom of our tradition and use it to better the world that we're in, which is, can be a controversial topic, it can be a controversial assertion to make. And I'm wondering what, kind of to start off, like, what do you feel like from your own work has been really profound in the teachings of our tradition, the culture of our tradition, that has kind of guided you and drove you in your own work, especially around like environmental topics and environmental issues, but I think also in general, like, you know, you are a highly professional, engaged devotee. So what is it about our tradition that moves you most profoundly in your own work in the world?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a really good question. How long do you have? An
hour.
Okay, all right. Well, you know, I think for me, I'll be honest with you, it's not so much what I can draw from the tradition, and I'm happy to speak to that, but it's more what I draw from wonderful Vaishnavas in our society, both now and in the past. I was kind of fortunate very early on in my Krishna consciousness to be exposed to some very wonderful revolutionary Vaishnavas, you know, in our movement, such as Shonaka Rishi Prabhu, who's the founder, director of the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies, Rancho Prabhu, who you just mentioned. In the UK, there's a devotee called Sitaram Prabhu, who's done amazing work on cow protection. And so I've always gravitated to devotees like that, and just seen how that they are so faithful and true to the practice and to Prabhupada and to ISKCON, but at the same time engage very much in mainstream society with the aim of making the world a better place and helping other people. And I was just blown away by that. And that was my starting in Krishna consciousness. So for me, that kind of worldview of being a devotee to engage in the world was never an extra aspect of my understanding of what Krishna consciousness was. It was always like a basic assumption, like if you're a devotee, you engage in the world. And then and those are contemporary Vaishnavas, you know, in our movement at the moment. But even, you know, going not so far back in our history, so like just Prabhupada as an example, so revolutionary. You know, you read his early articles in Back to Godhead, you know, he was trying to take the philosophy of the Bhagavatam and apply it to contemporary concerns, right? in a time when, you know, no one was really thinking like that in it, but he was. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur was, you know, and talk about revolutionaries, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, like so revolutionary in his thinking, in the way he conducted his own personal life, in his understanding of the role of Gaudiya Vaishnavism in a world, the fact that, you know, he saw the whole world coming to Mayapur in a time when, you know, India was under colonial rule.
Yeah.
You know, so I think this spirit of being revolutionary for Krishna, for Mahaprabhu, is so embedded in our society. And I think for every devotee, they have to discern what that revolutionary act or action is going to be, right? For me, that is the environment, sustainable development, and engagement with the United Nations. And I feel like that's a revolutionary act, because that's really never been attempted before in any meaningful way by ISKCON. So that's kind of where I draw my inspiration, is that the teachers in our line, you know, we're recording this just a few days after the, you know, the departure, the glorious departure of Srila Bhakti Charu Swami. And he was revolutionary. Like, he did things totally out of the box that many devotees don't know about. He helped devotees start businesses. I just found out that he started like a nutrition bar company in the US a number of years ago called Bhumi Bars or something like that. You know, he started business, he helped start businesses, he helped start educational initiatives. You know, I've visited his temple in Ujjain a number of times. So yeah, so it's personalities like that who have really shown the way that bhakti means to be faithful and loyal to the tradition and to the institution and to the parampara. But it also means to go out in the world and do new and innovative things that facilitate the spread of Krishna consciousness, but also help uplift all people in all places as well.
This brings me back to something that we talked about a little bit earlier in our previous conversation about sometimes there can be a tension between devotees who are brahmacharis or sannyasis, live in a more or less renounced lifestyle, or just a more renunciate pathway in life. And of course,
a bit like us, we're very renounced, I would say.
No. And then, you know, then there are the majority of us who you know, both of us have lived in attempted brahmachari ashrams at this point in our life.
Yep, been there, done that.
Right, and both of us are, you know, you're in your Rasta ashram. I may be moving into that soon. So, and of course, you know, those of us who know the history of the movement know that that's really almost 180 shift from how the movement started, when it was mostly young folks living as brahmacharis, brahmacharinis. Now we're mostly a congregational movement. But, and then we were talking earlier about how naturally, and especially in those of us who are grahastas, naturally we're engaged in the world. Of course we're engaged in the world. Yeah. It's a broader definition of engagement. I mean, just the fact that we have to work in the world, we most likely have colleagues, we have concerns, we have interests, which are not disconnected to our seva, but are not necessarily like pure devotional service. But I think there's a little bit of a qualitative difference, but I think you're pointing out to something, and this is something that will come up for folks who watch my conversation with Yogeshwar Prabhu. It's not that those who are swamis and renunciates are like completely disconnected from the world. You're just explaining what Bhakti Charu Swami has done. You know, our Guru Maharaj Radhanath Swami has done, you know, so many initiatives in India and around the world, hospitals, midday meals, the Govardhan Eco Village, and then, you know, Prabhupada's own example too. But there's that tension, and I think that tension is the thing that between being a movement which is about, you know, those core teachings are detachment from the Gita, like that's the core teaching, like act in a detached way, but you have to act. You can never be attached to not performing your duty.
Right.
So I'll throw another big question at you. How do we act in the world in a detached way? How do we live within that tension where we have to be engaged? But for example, we're not arguing that engaged bhakti is this thing where you just drop your seva and go, you know, live in a protest camp. I mean, if you're called to do that, and it's there, you know, we're not saying that's either, but it's not that we're saying, not that we're saying act, but act in an attached way. It's like, how do you act in a detached way and still like be concerned about justice in the world? I know that's a big question.
Yeah, no, that is a big question. Yeah, I think, at least, I mean, I can't speak for others, but I know for myself, like Engaged Bhakti, like I said, is not like an extra thing. It's inherently part of my practice, and it's my savor, it's my service. And I think the more we see our engagement in the world as a natural extension to our core practice of Krishna consciousness, to our chanting and our reading and our sadhu sangha, the more we can be engaged in the world, but with that spirit of not being attached, right? Because understanding that all service is absolute, there's no higher or there's no lower, and we're all called to do different things, right? And so if I'm called to care for the environment and called to network and engage with parts of society or kinds of people that I naturally gravitate towards, I do that with the understanding that Krishna has given me the facility or the blessings or the arrangement that I can do that. But knowing that like that's coming from Krishna, it's not coming from me.
Yeah.
Right. And at some point I may have to stop doing that because Krishna may want me to do something else.
Yeah.
And so that's my meditation, which is like, this is my service, my Engaged Bhakti, my work on climate change, my work with the UN is what my spiritual master, what my teachers, and ultimately what Krishna wants me to be doing at this moment. But knowing that at some point that may have to shift.
Yeah.
And the seed of that though is like a really heartfelt prayer and meditation, which is, how can I serve Prabhupada? How can I serve Mahaprabhu's movement? How can I make a positive contribution to the spreading of the Sankirtan movement? And if we have that prayer, then Krishna and the acharyas will facilitate our desire to serve. And, and the Kanishna Adhikari, sees Krishna only in the confines of the temple and therefore my interpretation is only sees service in the confines of a temple, right? The four walls. But we know like, a pure devotee, an Uttamadhikari, like sees everyone as a devotee and sees everyone, makes no distinction between inside the temple walls or outside the temple walls. And so at the same time, with our service, with helping other people, it's not that we only help people by chanting and distributing books, but there are other ways to help people. And it's not that we only help people who are interested in coming to our temple, but we want to help everyone because everyone is connected to Krishna. Everyone is on a journey to Krishna. Everyone is on a journey of understanding and self-realization. And so so that's how I kind of approach it, which is to think that because I never wanted to do environmental work. It literally fell in my lap. Like literally, I had no desire. I was a brahmachari like you. I was trying to do it, didn't work. But I tried it for a couple of years. And this opportunity literally fell in my lap. And now 10 years on, like I have, I'm still doing it and I have all these connections and I'm able to dovetail the work I'm doing in the climate change movement to help ISKCON step up its game when it works in respect to climate change and sustainability. So it's like, I think the seed is, how can I make a contribution, and understanding that whatever we're working on, know that that's my service and Krishna is asking me to do that. And it's not for the cause, but it's always, the service is always for ourselves, right? Yeah. It's always for our own purification. And in the result, we can actually make a contribution that benefits other people. And so I think that mentality really helps me. Yeah, but I think that's for everyone to discern, which is like, what kind of contribution they want to make, what kind of benefit do they want to, have in their community or their world or even in their homes.
Yeah. I mean, just even those core practices like Sankirtan, book distribution, preaching in general, that word preaching, like that's a word a lot of us go back and forth on in terms of like whether we use it or, but or outreach, as we like to say. But those in and of itself, like just in those core practices, our tradition is outward facing, right? It's like we're not, there's ocean of philosophical and theological critiques in our purports from Prabhupada, from our Goswamis that say, we're not monists, we're not, there's another term, quietists, which I think Christian use. The Christian,
I love it, quietist.
Quietist, like we're not navel gazers. We're not,
Right.
not turned inward on ourselves. Like the whole point of our tradition is outward engagement. So that was Mahaprabhu's example.
Right.
But you know, I always kind of see it like that. Those fundamental practices are like to use a environmental earthy metaphor, is like the trunk of the tree.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many different branches of engagement that some of us are engaged in. Like some of us do movement work, some of us do academic work. Some of us are just by, I think of our friend Yashoda Dalal here in New York, who like works in the financial world. And you can just, you know, knowing him just by his personality, like is conducive, just by his personality, engaging in the world is conducive to people learning about Krishna and Krishna consciousness.
Yeah.
I know it was interesting. My own experience as a brahmachari was like, I was living in New Vrindavan and I was working on some of the farm elements of that project. And that got me into kind of the whole seed was planted about the importance of Prabhupada's call for farm communities and rural communities. And then coming and living here in New York as a brahmachari, then we were just so engaged, preaching programs, college preaching, book distribution, that it was, I think I kind of have a similar experience as you. It's just like, even my time as a brahmachari, it was just like, go out and do, go out and be and present an example. So that, again, just reveals that it's just inherent to our practice. So,
and I think,
and
I think, and the beauty of Krishna consciousness is like, there's something there for everyone. Right. And alongside that, there are obligations or responsibilities for the different ashrams. Right. And so like for the monastics, like you're talking about, like the renunciates, the swamis and the brahmacharis and so on, like there are a certain set of obligations placed upon them, responsibilities and duties. And like you said earlier, but for the householders, for those who are living and working in the world, there are additional or different responsibilities and obligations, right? Like, isn't it like a householder is supposed to, every evening is supposed to go to their front door and like bang a pot 3 times or like call out, who's hungry, you know, and whoever's hungry, you know, they're supposed to cook enough for people to come, right? That obligation isn't there on swamis. That obligation isn't there on brahmacharis. And so, you know, I think there's just so much, I mean, one way is obviously obligations and responsibilities, but I just see it as opportunities. You know, the majority of ISKCON's membership is not living in a temple and are engaged in, you know, the finance world and the business world and academics and, like you said, movement building and government. We're engaged in the arts. We're engaged in so many spheres of mainstream society, which means that there are so many opportunities for us to share Krishna consciousness with others, right? But also understand what's actually going on in the world and how can ISKCON meaningfully engage with those issues. And so, yeah, I don't begrudge, or I don't feel bad that when I was a brahmachari, like my activities were restricted. I kind of actually enjoyed it because that allowed me to focus on my sadhana and my practice. But I had that understanding that when I left the ashram, I had a set of responsibilities which were different to my monastic life. And I think part of the work, and again, it's an opportunity, but I think part of the work of our generation is, it's something that Radhika Raman, Ravi Gupta, who's an old friend of mine, something that he used a word a number of years ago called missionology. I don't know if you're familiar with it. Maybe
a little bit. That term does pop up in like Christian.
Yeah, which is like, it's almost like, what's the philosophy behind our mission work, our preaching work? Like what? Because right now our preaching work, and again, just the fact that we use that word, our preaching is very much based on a Christian way of preaching, right? Go out and spread the good news, right? And that's definitely there in Mahaprabhu's time as well. But what can we draw on from our acharyas, from our lineage, from the life of Mahaprabhu, to kind of inform what it means to be a Vaishnava in a contemporary society, you know? And I think the struggle we have right now is that we haven't developed that. Like in the Catholic Church, they call it, you know, Catholic social teaching. Yeah. They literally have a teaching for how the Catholic Church should be engaged in society, right? In social issues. And at ISKCON, because we started off as a primarily monastic society, you know, our preaching and our language is all focused around that. So we place upon householders the same obligations and responsibilities as we do on our swamis and our brahmacharis, right? And I think within that, we lose so much because householders are engaged in so many ways, like I mentioned earlier, in ways that monastics aren't. So I think there were different sets of rules and responsibilities for different ashrams. And I think, like I said, I think the work of our generation is to really kind of dig into that. And definitely part of that for a lot of householders is this concept that we're talking about of engaged bhakti, which is engaging with these issues that the world's facing.
Yeah, and this, as you know, again, there definitely is, you can say, kind of there are elements of like a qualitative difference between those who are renunciates and those who are grihastas. But again, you know, it's not this black and white thing. I think the thing about bhakti is it's never a black and white thing.
Yeah.
And always a fluidity. There's always a creativity, and those who are renunciates can be the best examples of engaged bhakti. I think we can think of our Guru Maharaj Radhanath Swami as example. But we were also saying that there, and this is something I've noted, especially over the last 8 years when I was doing my graduate studies and was doing it in a Christian seminary, which is very focused on social justice issues and progressive issues. There is a certain instinct that Christians have, that our Jewish brothers and sisters have, a kind of that Abrahamic justice language, you know, that Christians, Jewish people, Muslim people. So when they see suffering in the world, there's an instinct to engage with it in a very concrete way. And they use that term justice language. That's like the core of, you ask a certain Christian, you know, what is the core of their devotion? And they would quite easily say justice. That's a challenge. I mean, there's a challenge for us. And I've noticed this in academic settings where I present myself as a Vaishnava scholar, but as a Hindu scholar as well. I'm coming from Union Seminary here in New York. And when I use the term justice, there's pushback from certain of my Hindu colleagues.
Including myself.
Right, yeah. Good. Because the language, the concept of justice, there's this tension where it does come from a non-like dharmic context. But at the same time, and then I'm always learning how to be more sensitive about using that terminology in dharmic settings. But I also feel compelled to make an argument that justice is also a universal concept, right? So I wonder, like this, and part of I think what we're trying to do with these conversations and in teasing out what engaged bhakti is to say that it's not that we don't have an instinct to engage with the world in a manner befitting to create justice. It's just that, and especially in our devotional sanghas, that instinct isn't so well developed. And as you're saying, like there's still is this part of the quality of renunciate lifestyle, which has been amplified for various reasons over the past 50 years, which still tends to take precedence in our culture. And not that, and again, it's not to say that kind of quality of renunciate life is wrong. It's an essential part of our tradition, but there has to be a little bit more of a balance, I think, between detachment and action. Like we tend to kind of maybe focus a little bit more on the detachment, and action gets neglected. And just sometimes I think we get the sense, even within our own communities, devotees don't necessarily feel comfortable talking about it because there can still be those kinds of cultural pressures.
Yeah. I mean, this is really important because, like, we've spoken about this. Like, I grew up, before I joined Krishna consciousness, the concept of justice was never, I grew up in a immigrant household in England. My father was from Kenya. My mother was from India. Never spoke about justice. I never knew what it was. And then when I came to Krishna consciousness, that was never a word that was used around me. And it's only in the last couple of years, really, after moving to America, I'm hearing it more and understanding it more. And I'll be honest with you, like I've been in settings with Christians from different traditions, like a Protestant and an evangelical and a Catholic, and I've asked, what does justice mean? And I've got different answers from them, from their, And so I think we need, within ISKCON, within the Society of Krishna Devotees, we need to develop this muscle, this institutional arm, which really kind of critically examines this. So what is the ISKCON social theory, or social teaching, and maybe it's justice, maybe the justice framework works, but maybe it's another framework, or maybe it's a number of frameworks, or it's a hybrid.
Yeah.
And I think we really need to do that, because we have so much to contribute, right? And I think this is where devotees struggle, because they know they have something to contribute personally and collectively, but we haven't built out the philosophical thinking to understand what that contribution is.
Yeah.
And then we haven't built out the institutions to apply that thinking, right?
Yeah.
So there's that parallel work of the thinking and then the practical work as well. But I do think like what you're doing is really groundbreaking, because you're really rooted, like you said, at Union Theological Seminary, really, really rooted in this justice work, which is so important and so prevalent in Western society. Now, let's take that, because we don't have anything to compare it to from the ISKCON tradition, at least at the moment. Let's kind of churn our philosophy and see, does the justice framework fit? And I think it will fit, but I think in that churning, just as they churn the ocean of milk, so many other good things may rise to the surface that will complement the justice framework, right?
Yeah.
And so I think it's a good starting point, but I think we need to go deeper into our tradition to understand, like, if I see suffering, what's my response, right? And it's interesting, I remember a morning walk, I think it was a morning walk, Prabhupada, and he was criticizing scientists, right? And he was like, scientists are trying to say that they want to get rid of all disease in the world, right? And here we are in a pandemic, right? He said, scientists are trying to get rid of all disease in the world. But he was, Prabhupada was harsh. He was saying that, he was harsh, but he was also true in saying, he was saying that, but the material world means suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can you get rid of disease? And if you get rid of disease, it's not possible, because the material world means suffering, and disease is a vehicle through which the material energy inflicts suffering on people.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so if suffering is part of the construct of the material energy, which it is, Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, this planet is a place of suffering. How do we, I think that's what you're getting at, is how do we reconcile the two? It's understanding, and this is where the Buddhists struggle as well, right? It's like understanding that the world is a place of suffering, but at the same time, not using that excuse to not try and stop suffering.
Right.
Right. And that's the tension. That's the tension.
I mean, just that, Buddhists who take the bodhisattva vow, right, who refuse to be liberated until every other being is liberated, right? Like that's always, that's as far as I understand, for Buddhists, that's like one of the most sacred principles of the tradition. But so this, and bringing up Buddhism, I mean, part of what we're exploring with Engaged Bhakti is connected to what Engaged Buddhism is, and people who are listening may or may not be aware of the Engaged Buddhist movement. There's a really good article, a good article online at lionsroar.com. It's the 14 Precepts of Engaged Buddhism. And this comes from Thich Nhat Hanh, who's the really renowned Buddhist teacher, poet, scholar, beautiful human being. One of his principles of precepts of Engaged Buddhism is about suffering. And he says, do not avoid contact with suffering or close your eyes before suffering. Do not lose awareness of the existence of suffering in the life of the world. Find ways to be with those who are suffering, including personal contact, visits, images, and sounds. By such means, awaken yourself and others to the reality of suffering in the world. And the Engaged Buddhist movement comes out of a similar tension. Again, as Buddhists are Dharmic cousins, right? So in terms of, as you're saying, ask a room full of Christians what justice means, you'll get as many different answers as people. Ask a room full of Hindus and Buddhists what Dharma means, and you'll get many different answers too. But, but I think at the core, something that connects justice and Dharma and Bhakti in this kind of dance is this sense, I think, in many ways, a sense that the world consists of suffering. That's the first noble truth of Buddhism. The world is made of suffering. Reality is suffering. And then justice movements, understanding of Dharma as our interconnectedness, Bhakti as our kind of mutual devotional ties, which is reflective, of our devotion to the Lord, to Krishna. There's a sense that there's no way we can avoid suffering, and there's no way we can avoid engaging with suffering. So
Right.
part of what I think we mean by engagement on a really foundational level is perceiving suffering, not ignoring it, and then doing whatever we can to alleviate it. And it's interesting what he says, because it's not necessarily, he says, find ways to be with those who are suffering. And he doesn't say necessarily go and like protest per se, or he doesn't necessarily say go and like sacrifice your life for a cause. Again, not that these things are necessarily wrong. Different people have different adhikars to do these things, but it's even the intimacy of his personal contact, visits, images, sounds. I think of all the chaplains,
Right.
heroes of the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just this movement to engage with suffering that is actually the core of engagement.
Yeah, and it's, there's that example. I think it's in the Gita. I'm not sure, in one of Prabhupada's purports, where he says, like, when one of Prabhupada's definition of ahimsa, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, where he says that one understanding of ahimsa is that you don't cause violence or harm to others, right? Yeah. But he says actually a higher principle or higher understanding of ahimsa is that if you see someone is about to be harmed and you do not do anything to stop that, like that's an even bigger violation, right? And he uses that in the context of sharing Krishna consciousness, that Krishna consciousness is the highest welfare work, as Prabhupada said, because we see that people are suffering due to not being connected to Krishna. And we offer them Krishna consciousness or the opportunity to understand who Krishna is. And therefore that stops their suffering, which is a really beautiful understanding, of ahimsa. But what if we extrapolated from that, took out the Krishna aspect of that, and just looked at it from a very material perspective, which is that if I see a man about to cross the street and about to get hit by a car, right, and I have it in my ability to stop him, and I don't, right?
Yeah.
I'm guilty of that man's suffering that's going to be a result of him being hit by that car, right? Yeah. And so I think for me, like, that's kind of at the heart of this, part of the heart of this Engaged Bhakti understanding is that we see suffering around us, that's for sure, right? And we're suffering all the time. But do I have it in my ability, in my capacity to stop the suffering of others? If I do, and I don't stop that suffering, am I implicit or complicit in that person's suffering? And I personally think I am.
Yeah.
If I have it in my sphere of influence to make people's lives better, and I don't, for whatever reason, then I'm guilty of being selfish and not trying to help other people. And I think for me, that's really, really, that's just what I've been taught as a devotee. And I think that's part of Prabhupada's teaching, which is that we have to help the suffering of other people, because that's just what a human being does.
Right. It's like, a devotee is also a human being. Let us be
newsflash. Yeah.
Temporarily, it may be that as it is the case, we are actually human beings, and we should never forget that. I think that's actually been, to be honest with you, that's been like one of the most, not that I forgot that in my time as a brahmachari, but like, because I had an opportunity, especially here in New York, our Bhaktivedanta ashram that was part of what's now the Bhakti Center. It was, right. We're a pretty open-minded group of guys. I think, especially my recent educational experience, getting my PhD, and especially studying these kinds of different Christian perspectives to justice, and just being around like really amazing people. You're like, yeah, it's a human being. That's not a bad thing to be. It's not, we should not be forever attached to it, but it's a good platform. We're very clear. It's a very good platform for devotional life.
Yeah. It's the basis of devotional life, right? Because Prabhupada said mode of goodness, right? At least get to the mode of goodness, which is like being a human being, and then think about being a devotee, right? So it's like, it's the baseline of all spiritual activity, which is living in the mode of goodness, which means being a decent human being. And I know that's a radical statement to say that we should be a good person, but kind of like Krishna consciousness 101 there, right there.
And you mentioned that purport. This is about ahimsa. So that's the first three verses of the 16th chapter of the Gita. And Prabhupada, that particular paragraph, Prabhupada says, ahimsa means not arresting the progressive life of any living entity. But he uses the rest of that paragraph to basically decry like slaughterhouses and killing animals as one example of that. But I think that's a great, I mean, there's that first sentence in and of itself is this wonderful sutra. Like, what does it mean not to arrest the progressive life of any living entity? I think that's like something which is a kind of a key statement for what like engaged bhakti is, or again, just being a human being in the world. I think we figured out maybe what engaged bhakti is. It's being a human being in the world. Amazing, in the very first podcast. But you made a statement about just kind of like, are you talking about like being aware of our complicity and in how others, our responsibility to help others to stop suffering, but then what might be termed as our complicity in people suffering or other living beings suffering. And I think, you know, this is something I know from my perspective, and I think also from your perspective in certain ways, which is not always applicable to every devotee, but my education has taught me a lot about like historical systems of injustice. So this is something that's also popping up a lot now in our culture. People are being aware that the last 500 years or so have been this really horrible history of colonization. The reason we have practically every fancy thing in the world is because it's this long history of certain people, European fair-skinned peoples, dominating darker-skinned peoples for the last 500 years, taking their land, taking their resources, taking their bodies. And you know, it's been really fascinating seeing this. I've been doing some of this work for some years now, and it's been really interesting. Like, I'll just turn on CNN randomly and you'll hear some anchor or some like cop, police chief, or even some military person starting to talk about this stuff. Like one of my union professors are like, systemic racism. We have to, I'm like, whoa, what's going on? But this makes me think of one of my favorite verses in the Gita, which is the Samadarshan verse. And I bring this up in conversation with Garuda, which we have as one of our other podcasts right now. And that verse, again, the translation is, the humble sages, by virtue of true knowledge, see with equal vision a learned and gentle Brahmana, a cow, an elephant, a dog, and a dog-eater, paragraph, outcast. Swapaka, as I talked with Garuda, generally can't translate that other than like one who eats dogs, but it's kind of a controversial translation, but others translate it as one who's been outcast, which of course refers to the caste system. And there's a really interesting essay in New York Times Magazine this past week about how race is kind of the outer covering of or justification for like a caste system in America too. So there's this sense that one of the manifestations of the Kali Yuga is that we tend to organize different groups of people above dominating other people. And that creates systems of injustice, of evil, if you want to use an Abrahamic term, of adharma, if you want to use a dharmic term. And then Prabhupada says in the purport, like, a Krishna conscious person does not make any distinction between species or castes. So the Brahmana and the outcast may be different from the social point of view, or a dog, a cow, and an elephant may be different from the point of view of species, but these differences of bodies are meaningless from the viewpoint of a learned transcendentalist. Such an understanding of the supreme is real knowledge. So there's a sense that Samadarshan, this equal vision, means that, you know, on a fundamental level, we're seeing every living being as a spirit soul. And that is our primary engagement with them on the spiritual level. But there's an interesting critique, which I've been guided by for the past couple of years from one of my mentors, Anantanand Rambachan, who is a Hindu scholar who has written a book called The Hindu Theology of Liberation. And I wanted to read this critique and we can talk about this a little bit, because it kind of points to this sense that sometimes we can attempt to have this spiritual vision, the Samadarshan vision, but it doesn't mean that we rise above our entanglement or our complicity in systems of injustice or prejudice or discrimination. So he says, most contemporary commentators on this Bhagavad Gita verse do not interrogate or problematize the category of outcast. The problem here is that when social categories and physical forms are treated as unreal, there is little incentive to change or to transform these. Such a reading of this text implies that the liberated will not see the distinctions that are in fact made and the suffering inflicted on the basis of such distinctions. One may argue that the liberated can and should see the underlying unity of all beings, but also the tragedies that follow in the world when this unity is not discerned and its social implications not discussed. If liberated persons do not see injustice, they can never become agents for social change. and religious teaching becomes irrelevant to social reality. So even as I'm reading that and just reading Prabhupada's purport, Prabhupada says the bodily distinctions are meaningless. But I'm not sure if we're saying that they're unreal. Like, it's kind of clear that we're not, we don't come from schools of thought that say this world is an illusion.
Right.
The fact that a person is in a brown or a black body suffers, that's not an illusion, that's real. On a certain level, we aspire to make those bodily distinctions meaningless, in the sense that there's no meaning that one should be over the other or one should be under the other.
Right.
I think that's what I'm discerning from reading Prabhupada's purport in connection to this. But I'm curious I think I've read this to you before from a nun's book, but I'm curious to kind of hear what you think about this argument that we need to interrogate why people are outcasts. We need to actually be concerned about the tragedies that come from the suffering in the world. And this kind of connects back to what Thich Nhat Hanh was saying, we have to be concerned with suffering. Do you think Rambachan's making a compelling interpretation or critique of this verse?
Yeah, it's good. And you were the first person a couple of years ago that kind of brought my attention to looking at this verse from this perspective. And I haven't given it a lot of thought, but it's definitely been on my mind, especially like within the context of climate change, where the most vulnerable are going to suffer the most and are suffering the most right now. And even in the current pandemic, the most vulnerable, the poorest in America, Black communities, are suffering from the pandemic worse than other people. So I do think about this, and yeah, it's challenging, right? Because Prabhupada says that in society, there'll always be people, for example, who want to eat meat, right? Yeah. Prabhupada says that. And we have to give them the facility to do that, right? And that facility needs to be there. I think Prabhupada even said at some point, like, in any society, like, prostitution will always be there, right? But it has to be kind of like, and I could be wrong, but I think Prabhupada said it has to be not regulated, but like, it's just a fact of life that human society is so vast and varied that like people will be doing things which are considered like unspeakable or uncultured, right? But I think there's a difference in my understanding, or the way I view it. I think there's a difference between being outcast but still respected, and being outcast and disrespected, in the sense that like, say we have a temple, right? And there are certain standards that we have to follow in the temple, right? Say we have a pujari room and there are certain standards in order to even go in the pujari room, right? And the person who's not allowed to go in the pujari room is probably the person who's not second initiated or hasn't taken a shower, before, or is not wearing clean cloth. And in one sense, they're outcast from the pujari room, right? But there are certain standards in order to enter into that threshold of the pujari room. And it's not that the person who can't go in is outcast in the sense that, oh no, this person is horrible, this person's bad. But it's that this person just isn't qualified at this stage to come into this space, and they need to do some things, whether get Gayatri or whatever it is like that. I don't know if this is a good analogy, but my point is, and I'm struggling to kind of understand this properly myself, is that, I think in the Western construct or in contemporary society, when we think of marginalized, we immediately think oppressed. And in the kind of in a Krishna conscious worldview or a Vedic worldview or a Hindu worldview, whatever you call it, I don't necessarily think that's the same, right? Because like you read and you hear about Lord Ram and Ram Raj and Lord Ram's kingdom. It said like everyone was cared for, right? Even the animals and so on. Everyone was cared for. In my understanding, what that means is like even those who are quote unquote outcast were cared for and given their facility. Right, to kind of thrive and be happy and to live out their life how they wanted to, right? But understanding that there are different kinds of people, and those different kinds of people have different kind of standards or qualities that they need to have in order to associate with each other. So it's difficult. I think it needs more interrogation, like internally within ISKCON and also just in society as a whole. But I think it comes back to this doesn't come back to, but it's part of this question, like the justice framing, like we said, that's a very Abrahamic framing. What can we bring from our Gaudiya tradition that can complement that framing, right? So now in the West, we have this framing that marginalized people or vulnerable people are always oppressed. Now I think that is true in Western, like capitalist societies, but I don't think that always has to be true. You know, I don't think that always has to be true.
I mean, you're making interesting points about, I think, just kind of, again, another like natural tension is that I think we understand through our culture, through kind of just the long strand of Vedic culture, and how that is manifested in our Vaishnava culture. There are obviously qualitative differences between different living beings, and there's qualitative differences between people. Like some of us have natural capacities to do this better. And that's not necessarily to make like a generalized argument that, you know, a lot of women in our movement struggle with these arguments that they're less intelligent or they're not capable of giving a Bhagavatam class or, you know, and those kind of general arguments are, you know, you can't really defend them, you know, in a real like black and white way. But, you know, it's like there are qualitative differences between different people and different living beings. And, you know, that is the mark of a great leader or a great facilitator or teacher, to be able to arrange a community or arrange a whole society around that. I mean, again, like even just in this conversation, if a devotee were to ask me what is justice in the context of our Dharma tradition, of our Bhakti tradition, I would say, well, look at all these purports in the Bhagavatam which say, you know, Maharaj Parikshit or Ram, King Ram, or, you know, any great leader in the Bhagavatam is always about making sure that every living being in the kingdom was cared for, which is, I mean, I often think about that as someone who's like, you know, trying to like, you know, those of us trying to make our way through this crazy pandemic world and just the insecurity of everyday life. Like, just imagine if like we had a leader who, or a set of leaders, or just we had a society which we all were taken care of. Like that's very anti-capitalist. That's very radical. You know, some might even compare that to something like socialism. You know, so, but there's the qualitative differences should never really lead to quantitative differences, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
So because you're different from me, you get less.
Yeah,
right? And different from me, you're lower on the on the pyramid scheme of the society. Like that's where things go wrong. That's what Kali Yuga seems to be.
Yeah. And there's an example, and I think it's true. I heard it a number of years ago. It's relation to the Radha Gopinath Mandir, Chowpatty Mandir. And it speaks to like the differences of responsibilities and obligations between, you know, like renunciates and householders. And so I heard many years ago at Chowpatty, and if I'm wrong, Chowpatty devotees can correct me afterwards. But, you know, Chowpatty caters to, you know, a broad cross spectrum of people in Mumbai. You know, it's in Marine Drive, which is a very affluent area, but, you know, has poor people in the area and so on. And what they found was that if they had programs where like literally millionaires or upper middle class or wealthy people were attending the program, and like poor people were attending the program, the poor people would feel really uncomfortable and uneasy, right? Because outside of the temple, they would never interact with wealthy people, or if they did, it was like a very unjust or not a nice interaction. And so they always kept their distance. And so they found that when they brought them to the temple, although they wanted everyone to be together, they found that they couldn't put them all in the same room because people, you know, not everyone's a pure devotee. Another news flash, right? We're all human beings and not everyone's a pure devotee. And so the devotees, I don't know if they're initiated or not, probably weren't. They were forced into a space that they weren't used to, right? And so I believe what happened was like the temple management, and this takes the spiritual vision, the kind of the Samadarshana, which is that, okay, you have these wealthy people and you have these poor people, right? Like from a material perspective, and they're not used to associating with each other. So let's ensure that we create the systems so that they can associate with each other and advance in their Krishna consciousness. So I think what they started doing was having separate programs, and then slowly started to integrate the two communities together. Right. And I think that's what it is. It's like the spiritual vision, which is like, okay, these two communities don't come together ordinarily, right? We can't just force them together.
Mm-hmm.
Let's build out the infrastructure, the institutions to support them in their growth of Krishna consciousness in their own communities. And then when the time is right, bring them together.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Krishna consciousness offers, right? It's like like you're saying, understanding the differences, and there are differences. We don't deny those, but understanding that those differences don't disqualify you from access to the practice of Krishna consciousness, or to dignity, or to a joyful life.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, Prabhupada, I think one of my favorite things that he expects of us is to build a house the whole world can live in. But that's,
Mm-hmm.
that inherently requires that you are aware of as Anant says, the kind of differences that come from not discerning the unity of all beings, mm-hmm. and the tragedies that follow. So we have to have, and it's, again, it's different devotees have different ways to discovering this. It's not that you have to do a PhD. I sincerely recommend it. I had a great experience, but it's not the boom industry of the world. You don't necessarily have to be working with the United Nations, although I think we both would encourage devotees to follow academic paths, to follow movement paths. Mm-hmm. But from each in their own place, I think one of the arguments we want to make, and I think one of the things we want to do in this podcast is provide people with kind of conversations in which we talk about historical literacy, we talk about historical awareness and social awareness, so we can kind of have the tools, as it were, to discern better how people are suffering and how we can engage with that. So I think that's, if we can do that over the course of this, then however long this whole podcast series lasts, then we can pat ourselves in the back a little bit.
Yeah, definitely, and see the opportunity. Like I'm working with a few interns now, second, third generation Indian American devotees, and like they're studying like international relations and politics and diplomacy, and like really kind of like amazing subjects that their parents probably would never have thought of studying, right? So like we have all this latent potential in our movement here in the United States, in Europe and India, all over the world, right? And what I'm seeing, having worked with ISKCON communities globally and with a lot of young people, is that they see the challenges that the world is going through. Like through social media, you can't be blind to the injustices and the suffering of the world. And so I think what a lot of young devotees are really crying out for is, I want to make a contribution. Like, I'm qualified. I have a business. I'm an entrepreneur. I have a tech company, or like I'm studying sustainable development or international relations. I want to make a contribution to what's going on in the world. And I want to be faithful to my practice of Krishna consciousness and the values that it gives me in doing that, right? And help me. Like, I really feel like that's their cry. Yeah. And I love that you brought up this, that famous, story of Prabhupada building a house the whole world could live in. And the way I see that is, yeah, Prabhupada will and has built that house, but sometimes things are separated by time, right? And we have that story in the early days in New York. And so Prabhupada has built that house, but I don't think that house is complete. I think in Prabhupada's earthly pastimes, he built a lot of the rooms of that house. I think he built the infrastructure. He laid the foundation for other rooms. And for other rooms, he left the blueprints. Yeah. Right. And I think it's for us and successive generations of devotees to build further rooms to that house, because that house is unlimited. It has to fill the whole world, it has to fill the whole universe. And so I think I really see this as an opportunity for ISKCON to grow, to be a really strong force for good in the world, and really be, something that we may not even envision right now. Yeah. Right. But we could be, and we should be, leading on issues of climate change, leading on issues of youth education, leading on issues of poverty reduction and hunger, leading on issues of gender. We should be the organization leading on these things. Yeah. And that's only going to happen if this understanding that we have a social responsibility really takes root and people feel like they want to engage in the world in that way. Yeah. So it's very exciting. I'm so happy that you're doing these podcasts, and thank you so much for letting me be part of the journey.
Thank you, Gopalji. This has been, I hope that all those listening found this a good primer to what this Engaged Bhakti thing is and what the podcast is going to be. I felt like we actually really, I always want to use like the cultivating the ground. But actually, no, that's a good environmental metaphor. Actually, we are cultivating the ground. We're planting seeds and we're seeing just where this might go. So I hope it was helpful. And so thank you very much for the time, for your time, for the conversation. And this is part of our first batch of podcasts, which are up now. So you can, if you like this conversation, we'll have a conversation with Yogeshwar Das, with Rancher Prime, with Garuda Das, again, all senior Prabhupada disciples with long, wonderful history in the movement. So we continue to unpack, and then we'll have more podcasts to follow in the next few weeks on our YouTube page and our Facebook page. So thank you, Gopal, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you
for listening. Haribol.
Hare Krishna.